Theodore Roosevelt wasn't supposed to become president. He wasn't supposed to become a war hero. He wasn't even supposed to become strong. When he was a child, doctors believed he would likely live a short, fragile life. He was thin, asthmatic, physically weak to the point where even basic activities felt like a battle against his own body. And yet, something strange happened, because the world didn't treat him like a failure. It treated him like background noise, not rejected, not attacked, just not fully registered, as if his presence didn't quite anchor in the minds of others. And that detail, almost invisible at the time, contains one of the most important truths about human interaction. Because this isn't just Roosevelt's story, it is a mirror of how every room you walk into works. You've probably felt it without naming it. You walk into a meeting, a classroom, a group chat, a workplace. You have something to say. You wait for the right moment. You speak. For a second, it feels like you've entered the conversation. But then, something subtle happens. Someone interrupts you, not aggressively, not intentionally, just naturally, effortlessly. You stop. You let it go. You don't want to seem difficult. A few minutes later, someone else says something nearly identical to what you just said, and suddenly, everything changes. People respond. They nod. They lean in. The idea becomes insightful. And you're left with a quiet confusion, because you know something nobody else in the room seems to notice. The idea didn't change. The perception of who said it did. At first, this feels unfair. But what's actually happening is more mechanical than emotional, because human beings are not neutral processors of information. They are pattern recognition machines under constant time pressure. Your brain is not trying to be accurate, it is trying to be fast. And in social environments, speed requires shortcuts. So when someone meets you for the first time, they don't analyze you deeply. They compress you in seconds. They take fragments of information, your posture, your timing, your eye contact, your voice tone, your hesitation before speaking, even how comfortable you seem occupying space, and they collapse all of it into a single internal file, who this person is. This file is what psychologists and sociologists refer to as a status snapshot. It is not conscious, it is automatic. And once it is formed, something very important happens. People stop treating you as raw information. They start treating you as a category. And categories are powerful, because once you're categorized, people stop re-evaluating you in real time. They stop asking, who is this right now? And start assuming, I already know who this is. This is why your first impression doesn't just matter, it lingers. Because the mind prefers consistency over correction. Correction requires effort. Consistency feels safe. This is where most people misunderstand their own experience. They think, if I just speak better, people will understand me. If I explain more clearly, they'll see my value. If I prove myself enough times, they'll update their opinion. But that's not how perception works, because once the snapshot is formed, explanation has limited power. The room does something else instead. It filters your behavior through the existing model. So if you were slightly uncertain once, future confidence gets interpreted as performance. If you were interrupted once, future speaking gets subconsciously deprioritized. If you were quiet early on, your silence becomes expected. Not because people consciously decide this, but because the mind tries to preserve its original model of reality. And here's where it becomes even more interesting. Because even when you change, people often don't immediately update. Not because they don't see the change, but because the mind forecasts behavior. So when you act differently, people don't think, he has changed. They think, this doesn't fit the pattern. And then they search for alternative explanations. He's just having a good day. He's trying to impress someone. This won't last. This is why transformation often feels invisible in the beginning. You are evolving internally, but externally, the world is still interacting with an older version of you, and that creates a psychological tension. You are one person experiencing yourself, but others are reacting to a different version stored in their memory. This is where Teddy Roosevelt becomes more than a historical figure, because he didn't just face physical limitation, he faced identity inertia. The world had already assigned him a role, the weak one, the fragile boy. And because people don't update identity quickly, they only update it when they're forced to. In 1882, a 23-year-old Roosevelt walked into the New York State Assembly. He had a high-pitched voice, a refined accent, and a frail build. The established politicians took one look at him and instantly assigned him a snapshot. They publicly mocked him. They called him Jane Dandy and Pumpkin Lily. They openly laughed at him during sessions. They expected him to shrink. They expected his reaction to match their classification of him. But Roosevelt didn't attempt to argue his way out of the snapshot. He walked directly into their calibration tests. When a heavy-set political veteran deliberately tried to physically block him in a narrow hallway, Roosevelt didn't nervously slide past. He didn't drop his eyes, and he didn't puff out his chest in a theatrical rage. He simply stopped, squared his shoulders, looked the man dead in the eye, and held the silence. He refused to move. The veteran, unnerved by the total lack of expected submission, eventually stepped aside. Roosevelt forced the men in that room to experience a jarring contradiction between his physical appearance and his behavior. He didn't demand their respect. He just made it increasingly uncomfortable for them to treat him like a joke. And slowly, the room shifted. Not overnight, but structurally. Because perception doesn't change from single events. It changes from repeated contradictions. When someone consistently behaves in a way that does not match the old snapshot, the room enters a recalibration phase. At first, it resists. Then it questions. Then, eventually, it updates. This is where most people fail without realizing it. They attempt change in bursts. One confident day, one strong moment, one assertive conversation. Then they revert. And each reversion reinforces the original snapshot more than the change ever did, because people prioritize stability over novelty. Now, consider what actually happens inside groups today. Groups are constantly silently negotiating an invisible hierarchy. This doesn't happen through overt aggression. It happens through calibration. People are constantly testing the boundary of your snapshot. They interrupt you mid-sentence, and subconsciously they watch what you do next. If you react with a spike in anxiety, if your voice goes up an octave, if you rush to finish your point, or if you simply stop talking and look down, you have confirmed the old pattern. The room relaxes. You validated their snapshot of you. But what happens if you don't? What happens if you treat the interruption as background noise? Someone cuts across you in a meeting. You stop talking. You look directly at the person who interrupted you. You let 2 full seconds of dead silence pass, and then you pick up your sentence exactly where you left off, at the exact same pace, without a single word of apology. The room feels a sudden physical friction. The person who interrupted you feels a spike of awkwardness. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't start an argument. You simply refused to be moved. When you stop rushing to justify your presence, you stop providing the room with the submissive reactions it expects. You force the people around you to process your presence without the crutch of your own over-clarification. But here's the final brutal truth that most self-help avoids. The people around you will try to pull you back. When you stop playing the old version of yourself, your friends and colleagues will feel uncomfortable. They'll make jokes. Why are you being so serious lately? Look who's suddenly in charge. Instead of recognizing this as a sign that the pattern is breaking, most people interpret it as rejection. They shrink back. But your peers aren't doing this because they want you to fail. They're doing it because human beings prefer a predictable background character to an unpredictable peer. The moment they start poking at your change is the moment the old snapshot is starting to crack. If you stay calm, if you stay unprovoked, the room eventually gives up. It realizes the old version of you is gone, and that has no choice but to adjust to the new one. Because the room doesn't care about your intentions. It doesn't track who you are trying to become. It only tracks what it has already seen enough times to trust. So tomorrow, nothing dramatic will happen. No announcement, no shift in atmosphere, no moment where people suddenly realize something about you. Someone will interrupt you again, just like before. Not because they are malicious, but because that is what has worked in the past. And in that moment, the entire system will quietly check you, not through words, through reaction time, through hesitation, through whether you yield like you used to. Most people don't notice this moment, but it is the only moment that matters, because it is where the old version of you either survives or starts to fail. If you react the same way you always have, nothing changes. Not because you lack value, but because the pattern stays intact. But if you don't rush, if you don't apologize, if you don't shrink, something subtle happens in the room. Not respect, not admiration, not approval, something more basic than that. Confusion. Because the prediction stops matching the behavior, and when prediction fails, the mind does something it can't avoid. It pays attention. And attention is the beginning of recalibration. Not because you demanded it, but because the old explanation of you stopped working without correction. This is the part most people miss. They think change happens when you become different, but in reality, change happens when your old version stops being useful to explain what people are seeing in real time. That is why some people stay stuck in how they are treated for years, not because they haven't changed, but because they never stayed changed long enough for contradiction to accumulate. And so the world keeps doing something simple. It reuses the oldest version of you that still feels reliable, until one day it doesn't. Not because you convinced anyone, but because the old interpretation finally stops surviving contact with you. And that is the real shift. Not becoming someone new, but becoming someone the old description can no longer hold. So the question was never, who are you becoming? It was, how long can you remain consistent before the world runs out of old explanations for you? Because the moment that happens, you are no longer interpreted, you are recalculated.